Morning for you. You cannot imagine how I am happy to meet you, not personally, but indirectly. I'm very happy. I would like to first to thank you very much for acceptance to have a discussion with the media TV based in Geneva, Switzerland. Espoir et dignité, hope and dignity. But I suspect you speak a little bit French. Hope and dignity. Yes. Hope and dignity. This is especially today what we need all over the world. Thank you, Omer, to be with us. For our audience, I will mention we will spend about 1 hour, if you agree. For our audience, you are a prominent scholar in history, professor in Brown University, USA, teaching European history and Germanistic. You are widely known as one of the best specialists about genocide. And we will have a discussion around the book Genocide. Where the book is here. Genocide, the Holocaust and Israel, Palestine, published in 2023 and reprinted several times since then. So this is the aim, the stem of our discussion, because I have been fascinated by the book. Your expertise provides a crucial lens through which to examine the ongoing war in Gaza, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the moral and political responsibilities of the Western nations. You were born in 1954 in Israel. Your family originates from Buchach in Ukraine, the former Ruthenia. You served in the Israeli army during 4 years during the war 73. You went to Sinai, to West Bank, to Gaza. I am a friend with Gaza. I went there 50 times the last 25 years. You studied in Tel Aviv, Oxford, and then you moved to the United States. So my first question would be a personal question to know you better. Did you write some memoir about that time living in Israel? How did you perceive at the time your personal situation in Israel? Why and how did you decide to emigrate to the US?
So first of all, just thank you for having me and for spending this hour with me. The reasons for leaving Israel in 1989 were complex and also not entirely planned. I had gone to study in England for my PhD, and then I returned to Israel in 1983, and I was very keen to return to Israel. I missed my family and my friends, and I started teaching at Tel Aviv University, and it was between 1983 and 1989 that I began increasingly feeling that the direction of Israeli politics was increasingly difficult for me to embrace. And as you recall, in December 1987, the first Intifada broke out. I was still quite young. I was a reserve officer in the Israeli army. I expected to be called up. The Minister of Defense at the time was Yitzhak Rabin, who we remember now as having been assassinated in 1995 for promoting some kind of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, the Oslo Accords. But in 1987, he was a former general and a minister of defense, and his response to the Arab uprising was very brutal.
Break the bond.
Yes, he called upon Israeli troops to break the arms and legs of Palestinian teenagers. And I could not see myself doing that. The likelihood of refusing to do that was to go to jail. And I wasn't too keen on going to jail either. And because I was a young academic and also had a small family already and felt somewhat trapped in Israeli academe, I was extremely happy to receive a fellowship from Harvard. for 3 years, a research fellowship at the Society of Fellows of Harvard. And so I have to say that my motivation at the time was mixed. Part of it was that I just felt disgusted by the way Israel was responding to the Intifada. And also I wanted to have a better academic career that I could envision in Israel. So it was not all altruistic. It was also very much part of my own thinking. At the time, I didn't really think that I would not come back to Israel. Like many Israelis, I was just going on a research trip, for 3 years. By the end of those 3 years, my own academic trajectory had changed somewhat. My personal life had changed, and the prospect of coming back to Israel appeared increasingly unattractive. But for several years thereafter, in fact, until the current crisis of October 7th, I always stayed in very close touch with Israel. I have family there, friends there. I've, in fact, become more interested in the history of Israel and Palestine over those years. And so while I made my career in the United States, Israel has certainly been part of me, and recently a very painful part of my own biography and self-understanding.
Thank you very much. If you agree, we will have a discussion in 3 different parts. The first part, I would like to focus on the general philosophy of your research as a historian, which is to me particularly attractive in your book, and I will explain you why. In the second part, we will discuss about the huge importance of your political analysis and positioning regarding the current genocide of Gaza, of course. And in the third part, we will try to take some ideas to extract from you some ideas for the future, if possible, as a participation to produce a real rational peace in the Near East. So for the first part, I will start to tell you some questions as historians. If I dare summarize the general idea of your publications, I would quote some significant sentences or expressions I found by reading your book. Between brackets, the historians need to take into account the individual stories of the participants to crimes, whatever the side they are, victims or perpetrators, subjectors to and makers of. You recommend to focus on the individuals, what you call first person history. Doing that, we are supposed to introduce some complexity. It is what you call the history from low, from the ground, from the base, opposed to the history from above. And you mention all available sources, diaries, post-war interviews, written, oral, audio, videotapes, testimony, courtroom accounts, memoirs. I have been interested by the importance of what you call also discrete signs in history. Personally, I am an anatomist, I studied physical anthropology, and we use exactly the same words, discrete signs, with regard to some very small anatomical features, apparently without interest, but in fact very important to reconstruct, to rebuild the filiation of the species. So I was surprised looking to this term, to this word. But, and I quote you, of course, it has to be integrated within a large documentary context. It is exactly my personal approach in writing books about Palestine the last 25 years to privilege the history of the people who lived the situation. But this is another subject. By the way, I'm currently in contact with an English movie maker working in the field of unknown events in the history of national liberation movements. And his name is very well known from you, Robert Lemkin. Robert Lemkin. So he told me it is a distant cousin or uncle, but there is a connection. He is connected to Raphael Lemkin by some way. So I would like to mention two books because I'm French, and you know how proud are the French people. In the French literature, two books. The Wandering Jew by Albert Land in 1929. Maybe you know this book. Albert Land was a highly respectable journalist who traveled at the end of the 20th century to many Jewish communities, the 1920s. He traveled in cities, ghettos, starting from London through Central Europe and finishing in Palestine. He described with a high degree of sympathy and compassion the terrible situation of the Jewish population he observed during his trip. I will come to you. Be patient. My very good friend, the French writer François Maspero, traveled in the same road as Albert Land, but in 1997. And he wrote a book entitled By Car Transit, describing in a very sensitive manner the complete destruction of these communities. By the way, I've been very happy to travel twice in Palestine with François Maspero. I wanted to make this mention. So coming back to your book, you detail in different places the very extensive field study you made in Buchach, in the current Ukraine. I don't know if the spelling is okay. Your mother's hometown. Would you be so kind as telling us how your investigation in the field modified the perception you had previously about the event that occurred in Buchach during the World War II?
Thank you. There's a lot in what you were saying that I would love to respond, but I'll begin with your last question on Buchach. Yeah, the spelling that you have is the Polish spelling, with CZ. In modern transliteration from Ukrainian, it's Buchach, it would be with the CH, but it's the same name. So my work on Buchach in many ways has to do with much of what you were saying. That is that from the very beginning, I'd say, of my own scholarly work, I was always interested in the people who make history, the people who are both subjected to history with an uppercase H, and those who are participants in it. What was called in Germany at the time when I began my PhD, eine Geschichte von unten, a history from below. And my first work was about the crimes of the Wehrmacht, as you probably know, and I looked at it through the perspective of the soldiers on the battlefield to try and understand their mentality. And years later, when I became more interested in the history of the Holocaust, I also began feeling discomfort with the historiography of the Holocaust as it existed at the time. And we're talking about the 1990s, which was mostly about the Holocaust as a kind of industrial killing, as compartmentalized, as a bureaucratic undertaking, in which people were put on trains and sent over long distances into extermination camps, so as to prevent any contact between, or minimize the contact between the perpetrators and the victims, which was not untrue, of course. This is part of the Holocaust. But I was interested increasingly in what happened on the ground when Jewish victims encountered their killers, and when the killers came to their towns and killed them. And I thought that the way to go about doing that would be to see what happens in one town. And I chose a town that I knew something about, which was my mother's hometown. I didn't know that much about it, but a little bit. I also knew about it because a very famous, I see that you're a man of letters, so, you know, a very famous Hebrew author, the only Hebrew language author to have received the Nobel Prize in Literature, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, came from that town of Buchach. So not only my mother, also Agnon, and he wrote many important books about it. In fact, it was the focus of much of his oeuvre. And so I looked at that town, I thought it would be, it would take me a couple of years to study what happened there, and it took me 20 years. Because in order to understand what happened there, I had to retool. I had to learn Polish history and Ukrainian history and Jewish East European history. And what I discovered was that when you look at genocide on the local level, you find that much of what you thought, looking from the top or looking from the center, looking from Berlin, from where decisions were made, much of the sort of conventional thinking was not quite right. And I'll just give one example, which is that when you look at genocide on the local level, including the Holocaust, you find that these distinctions we tend to make between perpetrators, victims, and bystanders don't work as well on the local level. One important thing is that there are no real bystanders, that everyone participates in that event because it happens in one town. You also find that the Germans, when they came to that town, their goal was to kill the Jews, but the town was not simply a Jewish town. It was a town with many, many other people living there, particularly Poles and Ukrainians. And the Germans activated the relations between Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, which over many years, certainly since the 19th century, were deteriorating because of ethno-nationalism. And they activated that to help them in carrying out their task. And so that the genocide was not simply an encounter between victims and perpetrators, but also a social event in which neighbors took an important part. Now, when I came to that area, when I started visiting it in the early 2000s, one thing that struck me in the whole area of what used to be East Galicia and now is West Ukraine was that this entire Jewish civilization that had been there for something like 400 years had disappeared. There was no memory of it. And I remember sort of visiting these towns, not only Buchach, many other towns in the area, and seeing remnants of cemeteries, of synagogues. Something was left behind, but there was no local memory of it. And I remember Ukrainian kids, herding goats and cows in abandoned cemeteries. And obviously they had no idea what that was because no one taught them. And I thought about how is it that there was not only a genocide in the sense that people were murdered, but also that the memory of who they were, of their civilization, and then of how they were killed was all erased. And I wrote a book about that called Erased. But as I was doing that and thinking about how this happens, this meaning of genocide, which is the eradication not only of people, but of the memory of their very existence, I started thinking about my own childhood and about growing up in Israel in the 1950s and 60s. This is just a few years after the Holocaust, after the War of 1948, and after the Nakba, after the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian population in what became the State of Israel. And I grew up surrounded still by remnants of that Palestinian civilization that had disappeared. There were houses, there were Sabra fences, there were, you could tell that there had been people living there. But just like Ukrainian kids in West Ukraine, when I visited it, we as children had no language to speak about it. Nobody talked about it. And gradually these remnants disappeared. For instance, the University of Tel Aviv, in which I later studied and where I taught, was built over a Palestinian village, Shahmuanis, that had disappeared gradually, but I still remember it from my childhood. So in that sense, my interest in looking at a history from below, and in many ways, a history from within, in the sense that it's also a first-person history, how people talked and remembered what they had experienced, also led me from the story of my family, because my mother, who came from Buchach, left with her family in 1935. The rest of my extended family were all murdered. It's a bit like Raphael Lemkin's family. He lost his entire family from his town in Poland. That transition from Buchach to Tel Aviv, that transition from Ukraine to Palestine, if you look at it through the perspective of first-person history, you begin to understand all the links, all the complicated links, much of them having to do with displacement, with these vast displacements of population. And you begin to understand how, although in historiography we have tried to completely compartmentalize the history of the Holocaust and the history of East European Jewry from the history of Zionism and the history of the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which itself is a fraught term. But in fact, on the individual level, these histories were closely mashed together, and you can't understand one without understanding the other. And if you begin to understand one and the tragedy of erasure of violence, you have to open your mind also to the tragedy of that other event, of the erasure of that civilization, often by people who themselves had been displaced by violence in the lands from which they came.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we'll start the second part regarding your political analysis and positioning regarding the genocide in Gaza. I must here mention your recent debate. You will have a smile. Your recent debate with another historian, Benny Morris. I observed the small smile you presented at the beginning of the discussion, knowing that the person you had in front of you and the hard battle likely to occur. I was not deceived. And I really wonder how Benny Morris can be a so well-known Israeli historian distorting so much the facts. You were the winner. Coming back to the genocide of the Palestinians, you said your position moved progressively with time, waiting Israel to fulfill the legal items of a crime of genocide, as described by Raphael Lemkin and in the Genocide Convention in 1948. This is between brackets, intent to destroy in a whole or in part a national group, killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily and mental harm, imposing living conditions intended to destroy the group. And at the opposite, Benny Morris used the Oxford Dictionary definition of the genocide, which was very surprising to me. Can you describe the very moment during the last 2 years, the very moment you understood that a genocide was in process?
Yes, and thank you for mentioning that somewhat frustrating conversation with Benny Morris, who I greatly appreciate. That's why I agreed to actually talk with him. He's a very important scholar, and I have great respect for his work as a historian. So it was frustrating to see his denialism, his clear attempt to deny the facts. For someone who is such an empirical historian, that was jarring. And I would say that it reflects much more than Benny Morris. It reflects something that you can see in Israeli society and across quite a few Jewish communities around the world, a strong effort to deny what is undeniable. And for that reason, when the war began, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, 2023, I wanted to be as cautious as I could and as well informed as I could be in evaluating the situation on the ground. Because as you remember, there were people who said right away, immediately after October 7th, that Israel was committing genocide. And I could not agree with that because I did not know what was about to happen. We all feared that this might happen, but it hadn't happened yet. And that was an indication of another problem with the term genocide, which is that it has often been used as a term of outrage. When you see something terrible, you see a massacre, you see war crimes, you immediately say, well, this must be genocide. And I wanted to stick not to the OED definition of genocide, which is not really relevant, but to the only relevant definition of genocide, which is, as you quoted, the one provided by the UN Convention of 1948. Interestingly, the same year that the State of Israel was founded, and for similar reasons. There are common roots to both these events. So I wanted to be very careful. Now, by November of 2023, that is just a month after the war began, I was quite clear that Israel was committing war crimes and potentially crimes against humanity, because by then, you will recall, about 10,000 people had already been killed. And all indications were that the vast majority of them were civilians. And so I was trying to find a balance between two elements. One was the kind of statements, genocidal statements, that were made by Israeli politicians and generals right after October 7th, on October 7th, October 8th, October 9th. These are statements that had a clear genocidal content and were also incitement to genocide. They'll have no water, they'll have no food, they'll have no power, they're human animals, they'll be treated as such, there are no uninvolved people, and so forth. We'll flatten Gaza. It'll be a second Nakba. All these terms were being used. It's remember what Amalek did to you, meaning you should do as the Bible tells you to do, eradicate them entirely. So I was trying to balance between those statements and the official war goals as they were declared by the IDF and by the Israeli government, which were to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages, which on the face of it appeared reasonable, because Israel was attacked, 800 civilians were murdered, and no country could not respond to that in some way. There were 250 hostages being held by Hamas at the time. And my moment of realization that it was no longer possible to deny that this was genocide came in May of 2024. And the reason was that in May 2024, the IDF moved into Rafah, the southernmost city of the Gaza Strip on the Egyptian border. And there were 1 million people there. Half of the population of Gaza was concentrated in Rafah because they had been displaced repeatedly by the IDF.
I was in Khan Yunis just at the time, in April 2024, in the hospital, European hospital.
So you experienced it yourself. I was only watching it from afar. And the IDF would tell people to leave their homes for their own safety, because these would become areas of operations. And when people left them, it would blow up their homes. And so all those people were now concentrated in Rafah, and the IDF told them to move out, because otherwise he couldn't operate there. And he moved them to Al-Mawasi, the sort of beach area. That's, by the way, the area where there had been settlements, Jewish settlements, before 2005.
Exactly.
And there was no humanitarian infrastructure there whatsoever. And they just moved into these what became vast tent cities. And then the IDF proceeded to completely destroy Rafah, so that by August, Rafah didn't exist anymore. It was just a pile of rubble. And it was at that point that I looked back at what had happened until then. And my conclusion was that what the IDF was doing was not implementing the official war goals, which were not really meant at all, but was actually acting in the spirit of those very genocidal statements that had been made right after October 7th. That is, that what he was trying to do was to make Gaza uninhabitable for its Palestinian population by destroying everything, not only homes, also schools and universities and mosques and water plants and museums and archives and agricultural lands, everything, so that people would not be able to live there, and then pushing the population to the extent that it could to the south, so that it would be prepared then for ethnic cleansing, to push them out of the Gaza Strip altogether. But of course, there was no place for these people to go. They could not leave Gaza. And that's a little bit of the difference between what happened and is happening in Gaza and what happened in the Nakba. Because in the Nakba, Palestinians could leave, and they did. They went to Jordan, Lebanon, and so forth. Here, they could not leave. So like many, many other genocides in the 20th century, what was envisioned from the very beginning, I think, by the Israeli political leadership, who saw October 7th as an opportunity to ethically cleanse Gaza, what began as that became a genocidal operation. To the extent, I wrote about this in August of 2024 in an article in The Guardian when I said this is genocide. Since then, there's been far more evidence of that. And the extent, of course, of the destruction of human lives is extraordinary. At a minimum now, we are talking about over 65,000 people killed, but probably the numbers are much higher than that, exceeding 100,000. We're talking about more than 160, 170,000 wounded, many of them with so-called life-changing wounds. We are talking also, because you mentioned the sections of actions within the Genocide Convention, which include killing members of the group. Obviously, large numbers have been killed. It includes causing severe mental and physical harm. There has been severe mental and physical harm, if you think of the children of Gaza, to the vast majority of the children of Gaza, creating conditions that would lead to the destruction of that group. That is not killing them directly, but creating those conditions of hunger, of exposure, of lack of any medical care, the systematic destruction of the medical infrastructure in Gaza, and prevention of birth, which was mentioned clearly only for the first time by the UN Commission just a couple of weeks ago. Among other things, a rise of 300% in miscarriages since October 7th. Every fifth child born is born underweight or prematurely, and they cannot get proper treatment, and women cannot feed them, breastfeed them, because they're starving themselves. The vast number of orphans, the vast numbers of children who've lost limbs. So what you're talking about is an attempt clearly to destroy the entire group as a group in Gaza.
Thank you very much. In a recent interview, the French President Macron declared it will be to the historians to qualify if a genocide has been perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinians or not. Could you comment?
Yes, it's a truly bizarre statement. I don't know if Macron actually read the Genocide Convention. The official name of the Genocide Convention is Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And the first paragraph of the Genocide Convention says that signatory states must act when they recognize genocide or the possibility of genocide to prevent it and to stop it when it's happening. So not only is it not a matter for historians, who obviously will write later on, it's also not a matter for the International Court of Justice, for the ICJ. States cannot wait for the ICJ to determine whether what is happening is genocide or not, although that's its role. It's been, South Africa applied to the ICJ already in late 2024. The ICJ issued provisional measures, but signatory states are not expected to wait for this adjudication, but to act upon what they see. It is not only something they can choose to do, they're actually obliged to act if they see genocide. And so Macron's statement is obviously a cop-out. And one aspect of this, because he's not the only one, of course, who's not saying that it's genocide, it's all leaders of the very same states that were the initiators of the regime of international law after 1945, the reason they don't use that term is precisely because they know that if they do, then they have to act to stop it. And they don't want to do that.
Yes, thank you. Honest people routinely are in favor of trials, courts, and judgments to stop impunity for the perpetrators of war crimes and mourn and grieve for the victims. But some say the courtroom is not the right place for an historian debate. It is quoted in your book. Can you explain us that?
Yeah, that's that. I'm actually teaching a seminar this semester. That's a very interesting question. So first of all, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and courts. Legal procedures, as they are with any other crimes, with conventional crimes, are crucial because the alternative to that is impunity. The difference between conventional crimes and even war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide is that genocide is a crime in which the entire society becomes complicit. And in that sense, genocide is the sort of crime that most people get away without any punishment because so many are involved. If you think about the case of Israel, we have not heard the Israeli Bar Association say anything about what's going on. We have not heard the the Association of Israeli Physicians speak
Even
out.
in France.
Or in France, but
Nothing.
Nothing. The Israeli Supreme Court, the beleaguered Israeli Supreme Court, has said nothing, and in fact has even denied that there is hunger in Gaza. The beleaguered Israeli Attorney General has said nothing about the severe breaches of international law by Israel. So what I'm saying is that when you try to punish those who are responsible for genocide, in any genocide, you have to choose. You have to choose particular representatives. But if you don't choose at all, then you are creating another precedent of impunity. Then other countries will do the same because there are always rogue actors who would like to carry out genocide for their own reasons. So you have to do it. And if Israeli actors, in the long run, I don't expect it to happen tomorrow or next month, but if Israeli actors are not brought to justice, this will be a terrible, terrible precedent for the future. Now, are courts the place where you determine historical truth? Well, some historians will say no. This was a big debate in France that I'm sure you are aware of, and Henri Rousseau, who's a good friend and colleague, thinks that's the wrong place. But I would say that's a bit more complicated than that. If we think about the Nuremberg Tribunal, the Nuremberg Tribunal of 1945, right? Mm-hmm. This was the first international court. This was the first time. It was no genocide there. They used the term but didn't really apply it. But it was the first international tribunal for war crimes and crimes against humanity in history. During that year of the trial, an enormous archive was put together in order to adjudicate those cases. And that archive was the basis for much of the early historiography of the Holocaust. Raoul Hilberg, who wrote the most important first book, used that archive more than anything else. So first of all, in that sense, you could say that these kinds of legal proceedings are of great importance to historians. I've used German records, court records. Now, the trials themselves were very problematic and often in Germany, and often people got off, although their guilt was absolutely obvious. But the records of those courts are of enormous significance to creating the historical, to reconstruct the historical event itself. And finally, I'd say, and I write about this in the book, courts work with witnesses. Nuremberg tried to avoid that and used only documents. But many German trials in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, as well as, of course, the Eichmann trial, used a great deal of first-person accounts. And those are important, first, because they tell you what happened from the point of view of an individual who was subjected to that, right? And secondly, because they create some kind of connection between the public and the trial. One problem with Nuremberg was that people found it boring because it was just a bunch of documents. When people tell you what happened to them, you begin to understand what genocide is actually about. Now, historians have for decades refused to use these first-person accounts, arguing that they were subjective, that they were not, people's memories fade and so forth, which is true. But at the same time, not using them meant that the kind of history they wrote was perpetrator history. They used only the documents, and the documents were produced by those carrying out the genocide. The victims couldn't produce documents. They were being murdered. They didn't have time to write documents. And therefore, using those in the courtroom setting shows you that when you construct history, you should also use them as part of the historical record. And many of the people who left accounts, testimonies, diaries, did that precisely as a record for historians. And as I write, they were betrayed for a long time by those historians who wanted to write an objective history of genocide, leaving the very record of those subjected to genocide out of their reconstruction.
Thank you very much. I read the book by Nicholas Stirgart about the German war, and I was very, very impressed by this book. With regards to so-called memory laws, so you warn against the state-imposed politics of memory. Individual stories often go against. Doing so, you introduce fraught issues of legal retribution for genocide and attempts to legislative forms of remembrance that privilege one set of memories and marginalize or even criminalize others. You also add which crime must be remembered, which must not, to the extent that their invocation may be punishable by law. In UK, and probably more in France, special orders have been issued to the court to pursue every mild sign of support to Palestinians, for example, to wear keffiyeh, to claim free Palestine in a public area, even raising a Palestinian flag in front of Mary. Hundreds of citizens have been deferred to the court, most of them originating from French former colonies. I was not sued to the court. I was not to the court till now. In UK, in France. In your book, you perfectly explain the pro and the contra, especially the possibility of judiciary treatment of the terms of the debates among historians. Practically, what would you recommend? And now I have a special question for you. Have you been eventually consulted for the elaboration of such a law?
Which sort of law do you mean? A memory law?
Memory law.
No.
You are specialists. You should have been interested too.
No. Yeah. Well, I'm interested, but people were not interested. People passing these laws were not interested, in my opinion. Yes. Okay. Look, in the chapter that you refer to, I talk about a triangular relationship that really interested me and also links my own interests, of course, of memory laws in Ukraine, in Poland, and in Israel. And of course, it's a bit ironic because when I was writing it, I did not expect everything that happened since. So now the two major conflicts that are endangering the entire international order and the rule of international law are the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Israeli genocidal campaign in Gaza. So that's what I wrote about there, was how what is called the duty to remember often comes together with a duty to forget. Now, we know that also just from the human mind. You can't remember everything. If you remember everything, you don't remember anything. The brain cannot sustain everything. So there is a process of selection. But here we are talking about political selection. And the political selection is, in order to remember particular things, events that are perceived as nationally of great importance, you have to unremember other aspects of those very same events. And so, let's say in the case of Ukraine, obviously independent Ukraine wanted to commemorate the Holodomor, the mass starvation, the genocidal starvation of Ukrainians under Stalinist policies in the early 1930s, where millions of Ukrainians died. But for World War II, he wanted to remember its heroic struggle for independence. And the problem with that heroic struggle for independence was that those heroes who were fighting for independence were also working with the Germans to murder the Jews, and independently of that, were ethnically cleansing the Poles. That's not a memory that people in Ukraine want to have. People in Poland wanted to have a memory of what they call the genocide in Eastern Poland, which is now Western Ukraine, Galicia and Volhynia. And they remember those Ukrainians as those Ukrainian freedom fighters, as those who carried out a genocide of Poles. So in Ukraine, you're not allowed to defame the heroes of the OUN and UPA, of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, by saying, God forbid, that they were involved in genocide. And in Poland, if you deny that, then you may also be subjected to judicial procedure. And in Israel, of course, not only did I and many generations after me always celebrated the War of Independence of 1948, this was imposed even on Palestinian citizens of Israel. In Palestinian schools in Israel, Palestinians had to celebrate Israeli independence. And what you could not do, and then later on a law was passed against it, was to commemorate the Nakba. And the problem is that Israeli independence came at the price of expelling the Palestinians. And so you cannot have a clean memory of independence, Jewish independence. Finally, after 2,000 years, a Jewish state has been resurrected, and then besmirch it with the fact that while Israel was being created, the Palestinians were being expelled, and there was a reason for the expulsion, meaning that was the only way to create a Jewish majority state, which was really the goal of Zionism. And that's just, by the way, the sort of topic of a forthcoming book of mine, which will be out also in French.
Yes, it was my last sentence. I can show you, it was prepared. The last sentence of the interview. Please wait for a moment.
Sure.
Yes. We will come to the conclusion with your next book, but maybe we conclude now that you are in favor of a referendum to be organized in Palestine with the participation of all natives, including refugees. Of course, to imagine the implementation of such a referendum today looks unrealistic. But to your opinion, what could be the results of such a referendum if implemented after a duration of a long-term truce, 20 years?
Look, I mean, I don't know what a referendum 20 years from now will produce. What I can say, and maybe, although we have to be very skeptical, maybe we have just seen potentially a slight turning of the tide. I'm not sure. But what we must see is a change in the political paradigm. And that change in the political paradigm must be based on the understanding that there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians living between the Jordan and the sea, and that they're not going anywhere, and that you cannot resolve whatever it is. It's not really a conflict. It's an Israeli occupation of different kinds over the Palestinians, whether they're citizens of Israel and they don't have full rights, or they're occupied in the West Bank, or they're being subjected to genocide in Gaza. You have to find a way for those 14 million people to share that space. Now, I happen to be a supporter of a particular plan for that, and that's called the Land for All. And that plan would be that there would be 2 sovereign states, Palestine and Israel, that they would be more or less along the borders of 1967, of before the 1967 war, but that they, unlike the no longer viable 2-state solution, they would be based on a distinction between citizenship and residence, so that you could be a citizen of one country, but reside in another. Both countries would have, of course, the right of self-determination would be the expression of the right of self-determination, and both countries would have the right of return. These are 2 things that Israel has and Palestine does not. But it means also that people could live across the border, and that the borders would be open, and that there would be confederal institutions in the shared capital of Jerusalem. That's a plan that has been worked out now for something like 12 years between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. It's not a sort of leftist Israeli pie in the sky, but it's a plan being worked out by both Palestinians and Jews. Is it possible to implement it now? Absolutely not. Where will it lead if there is the beginning of that? It's hard to say. It's possible that this kind of confederation, maybe 10 years after it's created, could lead to a referendum deciding that they actually all the residents want to have one state, in which all of them will have equal rights in one state. It's possible that they won't. But that, to my mind, is the most viable, realistic plan for the future. And anybody listening to this should look it up, A Land for All, and see all the details of this, I think, both visionary, but also very pragmatic and feasible plan for the future.
Thank you very much. So, my last question. You are now writing a new book planned for 2026, next year. Could you please provide us as a primary source with the contents?
Yeah, so the book is coming out in April in English, but also in French and some other languages, other European languages. It's called Israel, What Went Wrong? And to give you the sort of briefest gist of it, the question that I ask myself, and I ask in the book and try to address from various angles, is how is it possible that Zionism, which began, and you alluded to that in your early remarks, began as a movement of liberation and emancipation and appeal for humanitarianism by Jewish populations in Europe that were coming under increasing discrimination, anti-Semitism, and eventual violence and genocide, how that movement became a state ideology in Israel, which developed to be increasingly centralized, militaristic, expansionist, racist, and now also genocidal. How did that happen? And I try to follow that through various avenues. I don't believe that history is deterministic. Obviously, Zionism had 2 faces. One was the emancipatory one, and the other was the settler colonial one. Obviously, the settler colonial one won out. But among other things, I look, and I became very interested in that question, why is it that Israel never had a constitution? A constitution that was promised in its declaration of state, which is known in Israel as the Declaration of Independence, which was issued on May 14th, 1948, saying that by October of 1948, there would be a constitution. And we are still waiting for that constitution. And why everything that has happened, certainly since Netanyahu's current government, at the beginning of 2023, the judicial reform, so-called reform, which is actually a judicial coup, how that is rooted in the inability of the state to agree on a constitution. And as a final thing, what we see in Gaza is also the final stage in the transformation of the state of Israel itself, from something that had, at least for Israeli Jews, the semblance of a democracy, to a state that would be a full apartheid state and a complete authoritarian state, as well as a religious autocracy. That is the final nail in the coffin of what had once been a completely different Zionist ideology.
Thank you very much, Omer. It was a very fruitful, interesting. Looking for the next book. And thank you in the name of Hope and Dignity TV from Switzerland. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.